PowerPoint that I presented to my class, and I taught IFS over 2 nights of 5 hours, and then maybe another half of a night. So this is kind of going to be really compact, and I'm going to try to stay on topic. I do a lot of teaching with examples and then experiential stuff, but I'm just probably going to present the facts. And then if we want to do another session where we're talking about like cases and how it actually looks applied, I'm glad to do that too. Okay? So, first off, this is Dr. Schwartz. He's kind of like the popular rock star of the moment. If you've been in this field for any length of time, you know that people come and go and that theories are like fads, and this one is the current rage, the current fad. I think it's a fad because it's really effective. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a fad. I think it's just going to stay a really effective tool. The other part of this course that I teach is called Intergenerational Family Dynamics, and that is talking about genograms and basically a global look at the forest or the family, right? And IFS is a look at what I consider the trees in the forest. So I don't ever want to lose the forest for the trees, and I don't ever want to lose the trees in the forest. So if you ever want to talk about the larger systems theory stuff, I'm glad to do that. This I think is really well applied with the individuals, while you keep in that global perspective that some of us are trained in to be thinking bigger. So external family systems have parts. If you're familiar with addiction, maybe you've heard about the mascot and what are some of the other parts of addiction. And that's just saying that even in a larger system, we all play our parts, just like Cody and I direct. You all are therapists and staff, and we all do our part. Same thing internally. We have an internal family of systems. We have an internal manager, internal parts of ourselves that help us function as a tree in a forest. So, and I have a friend in Chicago who I've actually been able to refer 2 clients to because they moved to Chicago. Eric, I met at my MAPS training in 2019, and he trained with Dr. Schwartz, and he went all the way through all of the trainings, and I asked him, do I need to go take this training thing seriously? Because if you haven't heard, there's like 15,000 people on the wait list to be trained by Dr. Schwartz. He still trains in groups of 30. A couple of weeks ago, he trained my friend Michelle, and she actually got to be his demo in the class. Do you know Michelle Worley? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So lots of people want the training, but it's very hard to get into. So back to Eric, I just asked him, how are you using this? How, I don't want to use the word single-mindedly, how purist are you with IFS? And he said, I'm not. I don't use the language if it hangs up my clients, but I'm always thinking it. So he encouraged me to just find more about it back in 2019 rather than try to get into the trainings, the formal trainings. He says, I think you're good. I don't even use it the way that I was taught. So I think that's interesting. Basically, he created IFS in response to his clients' descriptions that he was experiencing. The clients were talking about their various parts, right? Part of me wants this, but another part of me wants that. And so what he found is that when all parts felt safe and heard and welcome in therapy, that they were less disruptive, and that the self could actually lead from those parts. So this is a key part of IFS, is that separates it from maybe ego state parts and traditional psychoanalytic, is that Dr. Schwartz believes, like Carl Rogers, in the basic good self place in each person. So, and if we're leading from that place, then we're able to feel and move through and be very effective. If we're leading from parts, which, parts are polarized, right? So part of me wants to tell this person to go to you know where, and this part of me wants to be forgiving and loving. If we let this part lead, we destroy relationships. If we let this part lead, we lose maybe part of ourself, right? And that's what we don't want to have happen. So in therapy, we seek to bring both of these parts together so that the self can lead. Then the self says, you know, I have this part of me that's thinking this, and I have another part of me that's thinking this. But rather than speaking from either part, I'm going to speak to them from self. And then my self is going to speak, not my parts. Does that make sense? Is that good?
Do you think it's always a polarization? Or could it be a part talking or working with and negotiating with the true self?
Yes.
You think it's always a part? Okay, so it's both.
I think it is both.
Okay.
They're always working in our best interest. In some part of our best interest. But as far as the self is the thing that is acting in our very best interest and can see all of our parts. Parts can only see their own limited view. So they aren't necessarily polarized, and they do have these working relationships that I'll touch on. So, you know that movie Inside Out? I like that movie because it started to get people into a place of, I mean, have y'all seen it? Mm-hmm. It starts to get you some idea that you have parts they're depicted like this graphic here. You can see like, this is joy, this is anger, this is depression or sadness, this is anxiety, and that's contempt, right? Because she's like, rolling her eyes. So in this movie, they all were up in this girl's brain, and they had a control panel that they could push the buttons on. But Joy acted more like the director, and she was telling them when to take timeouts and where to go. When I would say, if I was redoing the movie from an IFS perspective, I would put the little girl, the main character in the movie, up in her head in a director's seat with a megaphone, and she's the one directing and protecting the buttons here, and she could say, all right, Sadness, I'm going to let you push this button, or I'm going to push it for you, if that makes sense. So yeah, I like that movie, but I think that it's better to think of self being there, directing those parts. So let's see. This is a theory that's called the multiplicity of mind. It's the idea that each of us consists of many minds. So if you don't want to use the word parts, or your client uses the word mind, you can do that, okay? But the self is the core of a person that contains the leadership qualities. And there is something called the 8 C's that I can email everybody a handout on. And when we know that we're acting from self, or when we're being self-led and our clients are being self-led, we can hear curiosity in them, we can hear compassion, connectedness, calm. There's 8 C's, and I always forget them. And I don't have them written down here. Did anybody else know the other 8 C's? Curiosity, creative, did I say creative? So I can get you that handout. Confidence. So this theory posits that problems are created when people experience trauma or imbalance, polarized relationships, so that their parts take on these extreme roles to cope and to survive. It leads to this polarized inner systems and problems within the self being able to provide that good leadership. So this is how parts can get kind of frozen or stuck in time. I like Gabor Mate's words about authenticity and attachment. If we are forced to choose as a child between authenticity or attachment, we're going to choose attachment, and we're going to put parts of ourselves aside, right? We're going to go toward whatever's going to get us the kudos and whatever's going to keep us in relationships. So let's say we have an abusive parent. We're going to cut off the part of us that's hurt and put it over here, and we're going to move into that left brain kind of place where we just go into functioning, and maybe we have a manager that says, okay, your hurt isn't serving you, go back over here. I'm just gonna move into this part and function, right? So that's kind of where I believe that this stuff starts. It starts really early, that we split into parts. Family imbalances. When thinking of culture, certain aspects of a person are more privileged or valued. Some, like in the West, we value ambition versus being, and so that's can create like a part of a person that's so good at performing that's what they think is their self. They're just like this performer, and their authentic self is long gone. I don't want to get too political, but I think you could look at any of our big politician leaders. They're very much in a part like of themselves, and that's what gets rewarded, so they keep going. But if you don't see creativeness, curiosity, and compassion, it's a pretty good clue that they're just like driving out of, well, that's a Freudian word, their drive, which is something that Cody could teach on. He's good with drives. So this is a growth model. It's not necessarily worried about getting rid of the problems or the symptoms. In fact, it's saying the symptoms and the problems are what Dr. Schwartz calls a trailhead. And that's how you know where to go in with a person and start talking about their parts. So they'll come in with a problem, and you can say, you know, how do you experience that? And you might hear that they've got these two parts, and that's how that dialogue starts. The system wants to resolve itself because it has its own strengths. I still believe in natural family systems and biology, that homeostatic mechanisms are what keep us going upright. They're not always the healthiest though, right? Because if it's very healthy for me to be in my managing part and I'm not in touch with myself, I might be really effective at this, but I might not really be feeling. Okay. So eventually, the homeostasis of the system will kick in, and maybe a person would be super depressed. You have this public persona, we're seeing this in the news, unfortunately. You know, you have a very happy person externally, but internally they're really not doing well. And that's because this has overfunctioned at the cost of self. I always like covering the basic assumptions of theory. So for IFS, I think I've already covered that it's the nature of the mind to be subdivided. We all have a self, and that can be hard, right? When you're sitting with a person who's so lost in what they think is self and apart, and they have no curiosity, and they're mean to themselves and everyone around them. It's really hard to believe that they have a self, but that's what this theory encourages. And I don't know if any of y'all can say this in your own clinic, but I've never met someone who didn't have an exception. I've had clients that were just really hard. And I was probably their 15th therapist, and I wasn't their last. Some of the clients Bailey knows we've passed around here in the clinic because maybe they're very upset. But I still believe that if we can make it safe for people, which is why I like this theory, if you can make it safe for people, then they can start to function from that place of self. And those parts start to disarm and allow, more than even me as a therapist, but allow the person back to themselves. It's hard to believe, but we can be so cut off from self that we forget we have it.
So the set and setting wouldn't trigger the parts. You could actually just talk directly to the self.
Yeah, you can. If it's safe for that to happen, that's who you really want to be talking with in therapy. Yeah. A lot of times you're going to get protectors first, or managers, and that's when you align. You go to really showing them that you're understanding them. And Dr. Schwartz has a phrase called "all parts are welcome." It's might be even a book. don't know if the book is out there, All Parts Are Welcome. But he does say that often. So it's like whatever shows up, if you can stay in your own core self as a therapist, then you can stay in that place of compassionate curiosity and the connectedness and the calm, right? The clients just need a calm and an anxious presence. And if you can hold that space for their parts while they spin off, they're more likely to get in touch with their own core self just by meeting you. The parts will start to feel safe there. If you can withhold the judgment or even your own fear, right? Because it can be really scary when someone's looking at you with their head turning 360 degrees. I still had one experience that still just sends chills up my spine to this day, and it was when I was here, and but I worked my hardest to stay calm in that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be helpful to that person. So, but then they went to D, and I can't remember who else they went to after that. So, let's see. So we do have to be aware of the external system for clients as well when we're looking, because larger systems might not be safe. So we just have to be really aware. Make sure that a person has the safety and the freedom to make some of the shifts and changes. If you go real slow with this, that should become evident as you work, because when you make changes in a small part of the system, right, it will flush things up in the larger system. So I do think we have to be really careful with this theory, because it can be just as destabilizing as any of the others, especially if you get in touch with protector part right away. So let's talk about the parts. I find that clients relate to their own parts the same way that their parents related to them. So you can really hear when people are talking about themselves, you know, oh, I'm just so dumb, or I just can't get it, something's wrong with me. It's like you can almost hear in the background maybe the family of origin, or somewhere along the way the messages of you're just so weird, or you don't get it, kind of judgment, right? I was listening to my mentor today on a podcast, Dr. White, and he said, he was like, what happens, Jolynn asked him something like, what happens when blah, 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 and he says, oh, I think you're just meeting the past. You're getting the past. If you know that you haven't done anything to really trip up a reaction in the client, usually they're giving you the transference, they're putting that on you, whatever's from the past, right? So that's where it really helps to stay neutral and to stay like present with yourself and recognize this probably doesn't have a lot to do with me. Probably the way that they're expecting a person with power or authority to treat them. So if you can hold the space and say, you know, something curious like, oh, so this is how you feel. Have you ever felt this before? Rather than, no, I'm not doing that, right? So it can be helpful to think of parts as an inner tribe. They're made up of people of different ages with different temperaments, talents, and feelings. That's why a person might be really together in one session, and the next session come in and you think you're sitting with like a 2-year-old who's throwing a fit, or like a sad teenager, okay? No part is bad, every part exists for good reason, and that's one thing that I feel real confident when people are like so annoyed and upset that they have these parts that are maybe difficult or exaggerated responses. If you can tell them that you believe that that part came about because of survival, that usually helps that part feel heard and seen and respected. And I'm going to talk about how we talk to parts, but for now I think it's good just to know that you can have confidence that every part that exists in a person is, I mean, I think we all know all behavior makes sense in context. I haven't sat with anyone whose behavior doesn't make sense to me. I've sat with some people who've done some pretty terrible things. It doesn't mean they're good things, but they make sense. So It's the trauma that creates the polarization that you were asking about, Drew. The more intense the trauma, the more polarization you have. And sometimes the parts can be so polarized they don't even really know about each other, and the person really tries to shove them aside and say that I don't have that part. But when that part breaks through, that's when.
I think a lot of this is driven by a subconscious mechanism of protection that shows up in various ways. It creates dissociative amnesia. It creates parts. It creates disassociation. It creates parts shifting and changing, and it's all subconscious.
Right.
And it's not always under the control of the person. And dissociative personality disorder kind of plays into some of this. And you're right, it's like that's a super extreme situation.
That's just one end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And that's why I love this, because no matter how intense it is, this theory works even with that.
Yeah, right. And when that happens, those people usually black out. They don't remember what that part did. But when the part's more integrated, they do remember. Right. And I think that's part of the goal.
Is integrating
this
parts. Is the goal, the whole goal. Integrating, yeah. So internal family system, sometimes I forget the I doesn't stand for integration. Because to me, that is the whole goal, is welcoming the parts in, so that it's not like you lose the 2-year-old when you bring the 2-year-old home to self. You actually absorb it, and it's really cool. Sometimes parts are afraid of what will happen if I am healthy. Then what happens to that high functioning performer? Well, you actually just get better at it. Your whole system, you bring it home to self is the phrase. So we'll keep going, and then we'll talk more about the parts and how to talk to them. So this is the next, their bullet 5. We all have parts. Our experience influence how well they integrate and work together in harmony and balance, whether they're polarized or in conflict. And then burdens are the extreme ideas or feelings that are carried by parts that govern our lives. So this can be like family myths or rules, like legacies, burdens, and that's what Dr. Schwartz calls them, burdens. They come from the outside world. And then a person is organized to protect the self at all costs, so that's how the parts separate. Okay, that's dissociating our body, this kind of stuff. So when you have parts that have, well, we'll just keep going this way because I'm going to get to them. So the 3 main parts that Dr. Schwartz found that people have are called exiles, managers, and firefighters. This is just the organization. Common parts among people are the inner child, caretaker, the judge. So many people have parts that try to keep them safe and functional. That's those managers and firefighters. So it's important to understand all of the parts in the context of the whole person.
Which one of these is the protectors?
The protectors are managers and firefighters.
Okay.
They are protecting the exile. So exiles are why the protectors and managers work so hard. The exiles are the part that's hurt in the trauma, or worried about rejection, or not receiving attachment. So this is the part that most adults leave in the past and don't want to face. But then when something bad happens, they act out of that part, right? The exile escapes the jail. Then the managers, and that's actually when the firefighter comes in and says, hold on now, get back over here. And that's when people turn to addiction. Any kind of ism, workaholism, could be, even things that are rewarded by our society to try to keep those exiles back, okay? Exiles actually just flood the person. So a person might present to therapy because their exile got out at work. And then they're living with deep shame And it's like, I just want to not feel shame, so I'm going to do all these other things to distract myself from looking at this exile. And that's where we have managers that run the day-to-day life of us, okay, of our hearts. Managers have a hard time listening and being present with exiles, or even firefighters. So I'm trying to think of like how this, if a person presents to therapy and they're saying, yeah, I did this horrible thing at work, I just mowed over my boss and blah, 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 then a manager might come in and say, oh, but you know, I really don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about all the things that are going well, or this is my plan for how I'm going to take care of it. It's kind of loud, huh? So managers do this through all these things like striving, controlling, evaluating, caretaking, worrying. A lot of times people think that their self is their manager. This is like maybe a performer, right? And like I said, when managers lose the grip on keeping the exile back, that's when the firefighters come in. And these are highly impulsive parts that seek stimulation to override or dissociate from the exile's feelings. So when it's a hyper mode, it's like high performing and trying to stay busy and, you know, read lots of books or whatever it would be. And when it's hypo, it might be like just keeping a person in bed, keeping them isolated and not connected. Okay, hiding. Firefighter behavior tends to result in criticism from managers. So the firefighters disrupt the manager's plan. So the critic tries to shame and attack the firefighter, which then results in this cycle all over again. So that's how you have the relationship between these parts. So to break that, we want to get people in touch with their self. So they're not just a collection of parts, but they're actually operating out of that self. Dr. Schwartz has a phrase called the eye in the storm, right? And you can use that analogy with clients. There is an eye in every storm, but this is like the letter I. Eye in a storm. And blending and unblending is a thing that when a person comes in to your office and you feel like you don't have any access to self, there's no curiosity, they're not calm, they're not connected, they're very much like just in a part, then the work is to get to unblend from that part to get more access to self. So you can do that a couple of ways. I think, I'm not sure where it's at in the PowerPoint. Oh, it's ahead here. Skip ahead a couple. So this part here, making a decision about how to begin using the model of IFS. If a client has little to no curiosity about what's going on, in other words, they have like no insight about the fact that they have a self or that they're maybe really having polarized parts, that's when you can use direct access, which is to ask the client for permission. I think permission is a big word in IFS. And so you would say something to the client like, I wonder if it would be okay if I speak to that part of you, or just speak directly to that part of you that feels a lot of shame, or that part of you that's really working hard to manage. That's probably the first place you would go, is for the manager. Giving the manager credit, wow, you're doing such a good job keeping yourself upright. I wonder what that's like for this part of you. How do you feel about that part of you that's working so hard? And that's a form of externalizing then that gets the client kind of, you can almost hear it in the language, like if this is the part, then the person's like just working so hard to avoid, I don't know what it could be, avoid facing the fact that they've been neglecting a kidney stone for a few weeks. Okay, it's maybe a bad example that gets quite
Hard to ignore.
The manager's working real hard.
impossible, right? So now I have to remember where I was going with my analogy. This is what I get for making it personal. If I had no curiosity about it, right, and I'm just going, and I'm not aware of the fact that my body's hurting and needs to be taken care of, as my therapist, I might say, you know, tell me about what's going on for this part of you that's working so hard. Would it be okay with you if we talk to that part? And then when the client kind of is talking from this part to you directly, that's direct access, then you'll find that you might be able to ask them something like, how do you feel toward that part of you that just wants to keep going and doesn't want to have to stop for lithotripsy? And then that's when I pull out of this part and I can say, well, I'm actually kind of annoyed at that part of me because she just thinks she can plow through and she really needs to stop and take care of her health, right? So it's externalizing, right? So it's easier for me to reflect on that part of me than for me to reflect out of this space with any kind of curiosity. So that's direct access. Do I have your permission? Would it be okay? If you sense that the client has some curiosity and creativity, you ask them, how do you feel about that part of you? And they're like, well, you know, I think that she exists for a good reason. There's a lot of things to do, and she just doesn't really want to face pain, and you know. So you can, if you hear that in your client's language, then you can direct them with this insight, is what Dr. Schwartz calls it, and you can start to ask them to talk to that part. So you could say, why don't we just stay here for a minute and see if you can connect that part. Where do you feel it in your body? Right here, you know? And then, okay, what is your body telling you? I'm really tired of this. 3 weeks is a long time, you know? And you'll get a lot from that insight. If a client can use their own insight, it's worth 1,000 times, I've found, more than when I use direct access. So I do everything I can to try to get some space for curiosity with my clients. I'm going to email you all a script. I ran it off, but I didn't bring it. One of the ways that I get people in touch with their parts. It's an image guided exercise, and I just took it off YouTube, directly verbatim, and transcribed it from Dr. Schwartz himself. So if you're finding that a person is so blended that they can't get any access to self, that might be one way to do it, okay? Let's see what I skipped over here.
Saw how to use these. Go back and
Another one.
go over like 5 or 6 of them. Using the IFS model. I'll let you skip that.
2 back.
2 back,
Nope, 2 forward.
2 forward.
3 forward.
The goal of IFS is to move towards self-leadership, so that is where the self really is, the one that's living, doing life. And we're just speaking to our parts. Again, we're not speaking from them, but we're speaking to them. If we speak from the parts, that when you start hearing your clients shift in this kind of language, they're speaking to their parts. It's great. And basically, you are training yourself out of a job, which I tell my clients is the whole point. So if I can teach you the process, and the content can change. It might be in lots of other parts, but if you learn how to talk compassionately to your parts and how to bring them in and make decisions for them, that's called self-leadership. So it's like being the director of an orchestra, maybe. Then, so self-love would be one other way to say self-leadership. When the self organizes the parts of IFS, the parts don't go away, they just don't take on such extreme roles, and they can take on new roles that they want instead of what they feel like they should do. So that's really cool when I am really in a good place of self-leadership. I take good care of my body and myself. I can always tell when I'm split out into parts, like maybe instructor and director and other parts of me that I don't necessarily take great care of myself. But so reharmonizing is a goal. It's not to fuse all the parts into one big thing, but to help them work better so that the mind is balanced and the parts are in harmony. Feels like all your parts are in sync and the mind is one unit. And then the parts, sometimes when you work with people at the very beginning, they'll tell you that like their parts do not trust their self. It's like, how do you feel toward that part? Well, I think she's going too hard and she needs to slow down and has a kidney stone. Well, then, okay, how does that part feel about you? What does that part want to say to you? Slow down, take care of your body, drink more water. So, and then, I even have had to talk to myself, a younger part of me that would neglect my body. And I've had to say, okay, I understand your concern that you think I'm outrunning a kidney stone, but I am telling you that I know how to pass a kidney stone, and I give it a few weeks, and then if it doesn't pass, then I go to the doctor. I'm not gonna just go run to the ER because they can't do really much for me there anyways, right? So I had to tell that younger part of me, I'm not neglecting myself. I know what I'm doing actually. But if I get into this part, then I kind of fall apart and think, this part doesn't trust me to take care of me because I had so many years of ignoring my body, right? So when we're integrating our parts, they're all talking. Past selves, younger parts, me now saying, okay, it's been a few weeks. I went and got a CT this morning, so hopefully I don't have to have lithotripsy. I just keep drinking water. Anyways, yes, that example is real right now.
I was kind of picking up on that.
Yeah, I wish I would have planned a better example, like somebody, not me. But
So is a kidney stone a part?
Not for long.
I do have parts.
It's integrated.
Which maybe is good. I did bring my own therapist to class to do a demo for my students, and the first thing she did was she was like, okay, I have to check in with my parts to make sure before I start my lecture. And she's like, oh, part of me that's really worried I'm going to drop an F-bomb. And we all started laughing. I was like, it's already been done. So anyways, we do all have parts as therapists. And this is why, part of why I teach this course at the beginning of the MFT journey is to help the young therapists recognize how much their own stuff enters the room. Because to stay in core self-energy with your clients is the key. Because then they get to be in all their parts and you get to hold space for that self. So yeah, it's important we do our own work and recognize our own parts. I just finished that ketamine certification on Tuesday night at 7:30. I was up in my office and my trainer, he's in Thailand, he looks at me and he goes, I said, well, I showed him this video of this girl doing this ketamine journey and session, and she's like, I feel like I'm doing it wrong, and I was just like, oh, so you feel like you're doing it wrong. The goal in that is to really be a mirror and not say anything. And Saj had me pause it, and he goes, Melanie, do you feel like she's doing it wrong? And I said, yes. And he's like, okay, we need to get in touch with that part, right? Because anyways, so it's really good to be aware of our own parts. And in this case, I'm going to use that to work with that client. So you can even say, if a client's not aware of their parts, part of me feels like part of you also isn't listening to another part of you. What's another way to look at this? So, how much time do we have? 15 minutes? I think this is just self-explanatory if you read through this slide. It is really neat to watch parts soften back and reflect their non-extreme intentions when you can see that these parts are, and the client can experience that these parts are just trying to help them. So when you're using IFS, you're going to listen for those polarizations. You're going to listen for words like parts of me. You're going to look for polarizations among the person, because a lot of times those are family of origin polarizations. Okay. If it's feelings that people are reporting, focus on that. There's something called the 5 F's. Find, focus, feel, befriend, and what's the last one? Fears. So if a client comes in with the trailhead and you can help them find it in their body, help them focus on that, ask them how they feel toward it. Again, that's how you get that distance rather than how do you feel about it. Then they'll start speaking from that part. If you say how do you feel toward that part of you, they have some distance and they have some vocabulary and some space generally. And then a very powerful question when you get find, focus, feel toward, befriend happening is what is that part afraid of? What is that part fear? Because this part fears maybe that I'm backsliding and I'm not going to take care of my health and my body again. This part fears that all my commitments are going to fall apart. But they can only see those, parts. I can see both. I can see I'm not going to let everything fall apart and I'm not completely neglecting my body. Okay? So I direct from here. Let's see. That's the parallel dynamics is the family of origin stuff. And I've actually just done a deeper dive on the way Carl Jung talked about childhood. And I love this, and I'm going to botch up the quote, but it's something to the effect that to think that it's childish to think that we can leave the past behind. And ironically, we have to become a child to learn from the past, right? So that old stuff, that Jungian, Freudian, bottom of the iceberg, dissociative, unconscious stuff is all over in IFS. It's all through this. That's the parallel dynamics. And that's where you're going to find that authenticity and attachment. A lot of times these parts exist out of that. So when you introduce the language of IFS, when that happens, what do you say yourself? So part of you feels. Do you ever argue with yourself about this? So another part of you feels. That's when you're in core self with a client, you can say those things from a place of curiosity. How are you feeling right now? What are you noticing right now? That's always a great way to just bring a client back into your office if they've gone into a part. And this was where we came back to. Assessing fears, that is a great way to gain insight. I already addressed assessing a client's external context and constraints to doing the work. If you have like a teenager who's in a household where there's ongoing neglect, to get in touch with an exile is going to be really intense. And, like if they're still relying on their parent for financial support, you just have to be really mindful when you're working with those exiles that are still experiencing injury. So we want to first align with those managers and ask for permission. So let's see, what did I teach about this? If a client really can't imagine that they have parts, then you can move into the somatic pieces there, ask about the location and part in the body. And then this is just more of the language around this. One way, I'll just maybe mention one of these. One way that I help a client, if I really have good access to their exile, but maybe there's not time to work with and unburden that exile, then I will ask if they want to bring that part that child, where they want to put that child. Sometimes they want to take them home, sometimes they want to leave them at my office coloring. And that can be really helpful, then we can do that. I'll agree to take care of their exile in my office. So that's one way to help kind of split this up, because you don't do this whole theory in an hour, right, with clients. It can take months. I do think that it's a faster theory than anything that I've been trained in, actually. So that's why it is I first got exposed to IFS in 2012 when I was graduating, and I read Dr. Schwartz's book, this one. Actually, I don't think it was this one. It was one of the, I think it might have been All Parts Are Welcome. And I borrowed the book to go on a trip. It was Dr. Robertson's book. And she told me, I was on a cruise, and she said, just don't let it go off the side of the ship. And I laughed, haha. Well, I took it for coffee, and I'm reading it, and my coffee spilled all over it. It was a signed copy by Dr. Schwartz. So I called Dr. Schwartz's office, and he was actually in Ireland. He signed a book and sent it over to me that by the time I got back, I was able to give Dr. Robertson the coffee stain book and the other one. So I was super happy about that. But yeah, so I've been using this theory since 2012. I've been very curious about it, but in 2019, when I did my training with Michael and Annie Midoffer and MAPS, that's when I got really exposed to IFS. And that's why I say I think that it's a great theory, especially with psychedelics, because psychedelics gives people access to the parts that they haven't necessarily known or named, and it can really bring those up, which is why it's so destabilizing. And why you need some kind of a structure to hang it on, okay? The room technique one, I'll just mention that one too. If a person has a part that they're really afraid of, like an exile that's very tender and doesn't want to come out, but they're in touch with it, you can ask them to put it in like a glass room. Put it in a glass room, give that part whatever they want. We can talk to it, and get, from it, but it kind of helps put some sort of it's just a technique that I've found really helps people feel a little bit more safe, because they don't trust that part. That's maybe a feral child to some of them, right? They don't trust that part, but also the child is like not trusting the therapist or their self, because a lot of times this person has ignored that child for years, and so that child is like mad or frustrated or very untrusting. So when you ask, how do you feel toward that part, how does that part feel toward you, some of the first things you're going to hear is, I don't trust it, it's a liar, or she doesn't take care of me, like this child tugging on me, right? So that's one way that you can, and I'll send you guys that other the other script for getting access and putting that child in the room technique, or that part in the room. I think I'm gonna skip working with families with IFS. I will say that, being an instructor at Friends, I have access to a video library of all kinds of famous experts doing actual therapy, and I have about 7 hours of Dr. Schwartz doing couples therapy and working like in real time. So if any of you ever want to access that, I can probably just log in on your computer under my Friends account or something, and then you can pull that up. I mean, anybody who's been anybody in therapy, I have hours of access to that stuff. So I just realized how little I offer that to you all. Are you still supervising in the program?
No, but I still have an email address.
Okay, so you can still log in. Have you seen the psychotherapy.net on the resource center? Yeah, the library just bought that whole catalog for us.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's its own, how you go into ProQuest journals, psychotherapy.net has all that. So this is where I ask my students to know thyself, right? This is one thing that I think our program does really well. Spends the whole first 6 months saying this is a transformative journey. if you don't know yourself and your own triggers and your own parts, you're going to struggle to help other people know theirs. So therapist parts interact with client parts. It's a good idea to gain understanding of your own parts rather than your parts reacting. So guide with yourself in session. Striving parts might want change fast and they can be very directive. Pessimistic parts want to blame or give up when therapy isn't going well. The approval-seeking part can be worried about being liked. Can you imagine? Like, I think the first, I don't know how many years of my life as a therapist, I worried more about being liked. I was not always effective, right? I mean, thankfully, there's something to be said about the relationship and the common factors, but sometimes you don't, you have to say hard things. So I can't let that part of me that wants to be liked lead in therapy. Also don't want the angry part of me, that feels burdened by my client's needs to speak. Or my hurt parts, if I over-identify with my client's pain, that's like both feed in and then I can't be helpful because I'm actually triggered and acting out of a younger part of me that's trying to right the world. And that's where we go into that Jung quote, until you make the unconscious conscious. It will play out, you will call it fate, and it will play out in all of your relationships, and it plays out in our clinics too. So if you're evaluating and critical with your own characteristics at the client, you might say, wow, if they think they're fat, I'm really fat, and then you get in your own head and you can't really help that person identify unhealthy thinking or maybe unhealthy eating patterns. So imagine if you led therapy from whatever the part is, and then how might you lead with self instead? I know my own therapist recently said, she's like, I'm having a part come in now and I need you to stop for a minute and check. She's like this for a while and then she goes, okay, right. So it is a problem solving part of me, but I do wonder if you've considered, and then she gave me like what has worked for her in that situation. And it was helpful. But my system really appreciated that because I'm a little skeptical of a person who thinks that they know better for me what to do. So it might have worked for her, but do you hear that, right? I think for the first few years in therapy, I was always doing like, oh, this is what worked for me. I was fixing instead of really just being present with clients and saying, okay, this might work. See if your system wants to throw it out or keep it. But that's one way that you really align and earn the manager's respect and trust. And then you get more access to exiles, which is where the work probably needs to go, right? So I do have this is my favorite book by Dr. Schwartz, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For. And it is specifically for couples. And I have a ton of notes from every time that I read that, I get more from it. And that could be its own teaching just for working with couples. But, obviously if you have a family or couples in your office, you know that their parts are going to be reacting to their parts, right? And somehow we find partners that plug right into those parts, those subconscious drives, right? So if you want to talk any kind of cases around this, please find me, and I'm glad to put this lens around it if you're struggling to conceive of how this applies. I just want to spitball about ideas with it. I love talking about this stuff. So thanks for letting me share.
Thank you.
Thank you.